Hello, my name is Hetty Verhagen and I'm a therapeutic social worker with a special interest in working with families who are affected by child-to-parent violence and aggression. In this webinar, I would like to give you a brief introduction to what CPVA is and explore some of the reasons why CPVA may be happening. CPVA is a complex phenomenon, so I won't pretend that we can fully explore the subject here, or that I can give you the magic strategy that will make it go away. What I do hope to share with you is some of what I've learned about CPVA and perhaps a different way of thinking about why children may respond or express themselves through violence and aggression. I will also share a few strategies with you that have helped other families and which might give you some ideas of things to try yourself. So what are we talking about when we say CPVA? It has been known by many other names over the years: parent abuse, adolescent to parent violence and abuse, aggression towards family and caregivers in childhood and adolescence, and childhood challenging aggressive, violent and aggressive behaviour. I choose to use the term child-to-parent violence and aggression here because that's a term that many people are familiar with, but I understand that you may prefer a different term which captures your experience more closely. So what might CPVA look like? Let's consider this definition. Behaviour is considered to be violent if others in the family feel threatened, intimidated or controlled by it, and if they believe that they must adjust their own behaviour to accommodate threats or anticipation of violence. This definition captures the fact that the impact of CPVA goes beyond the pain and bruises that we may associate with the words violence and aggression. It shows that the anticipation of what might happen, the walking on eggshells that many parents talk about, play a huge role too. I meet with many families who tell me that it can be hard to put a finger on what creates this atmosphere of threat because so much of it sounds like normal childhood or adolescence frustration and opposition. The difference is that others in the family feel that they have to change their behaviour to avoid incidents of CPVA. We know from research that CPVA occurs all over the world and in all kinds of families. Some studies suggest that 1 in 10 of all families experience violence and aggression from one of their children. That statistic suggests that CPVA may be a lot more common than many of us think. Here are some of the experiences families living with CPVA may have. Verbal abuse, aggression and threats may happen during incidents or may happen more frequently throughout the day. That could be name-calling, threats to hurt people or pets, damage belongings, using an aggressive tone of voice, or swearing and screaming in anger. Physical aggression could include hitting, kicking, biting, pushing and tripping people over, throwing things at others, hitting with items or threatening to do this. Some families find that almost any item in the house might be used as a weapon. Bullying is often more subtle. Examples might be constant criticism, undermining parents' authority, ignoring or other oppositional behaviours. Some parents might feel that this creates a situation that feels emotionally abusive. Damage to home and property might include things like holes in the wall, broken furniture, doors off their hinges, but also includes behaviours such as breaking, hiding or giving away objects with an emotional value. Attacks on siblings and pets can happen during CPVA incidents or may appear to be more deliberate. Financial demands may trigger threats, verbal or physical aggression if they are refused. Other families might feel that they have to comply with requests or demands for money and items in order to avoid incidents and keep the peace. Research tells us that CPVA may be more common in adoptive families and families with children who are looked after, as well as families with children who have additional needs. Let's look at why this may be. You may have noticed that I talk about families living with CPVA instead of parenting a child with CPVA. That is because we have found that it is not helpful to think about CPVA in terms of the parent as a victim and the child as the aggressor or perpetrator. In families living with CPVA, both adults and children are victims. In this webinar, we are thinking about adopted children who react or express their distress through violence and aggression, as well as their families, and I will be discussing this in the context of a child's experiences of trauma. We know that children who are adopted have often experienced neglect and abuse in their first families. And even if this wasn't the case, all children who are adopted have had the experience of losing at least one, and often more than one, parent or family member that was familiar to them. Even babies who were taken into local authority care soon after birth experience the loss of everything they know about themselves and the world when they lose their birth mother, because their mother's voice and movements were their whole world in utero. If we see trauma as anything that overwhelms our coping skills, this loss is only one of many other traumatic experiences for adopted children, including the move to their adoptive family. Even though this decision was made with the child's best intentions at heart, it can't be denied that moving to another home, settling into a new family in an unfamiliar environment, and learning the rules and expectations in this new home, often by trial and error, is a thoroughly overwhelming experience, no matter how sensitively it's handled by the new parents. If children react to past trauma or current overwhelm with shyness, tears, or hiding away, it's usually quite easy for parents to respond to them with understanding and empathy. But it's a lot harder to feel compassionate towards a child who reacts to the same feelings with aggression or violence. That means that we tend to interpret this kind of behaviour as something different, something that needs a different kind of response than empathy and understanding. It's therefore important to remind yourself that an angry child is almost always a frightened child. It might be helpful to look at some common misconceptions about CPVA in adoptive families. It is not a purely behavioural issue. This behaviour is a response to an internal, often unconscious trigger. It's tempting to think that we can stop children's violence and aggression through giving consequences, punishments or rewards. Over the years, numerous children and teenagers have shared with me how ashamed and remorseful they feel after aggressive incidents. It is my firm conviction that if children and teenagers could stop this behaviour, they absolutely would stop. Punishments and rewards may have a positive effect in some cases, but often only in the short term. And for most children, these strategies only add to the pressure and anxiety they are already experiencing. They know they may lose control again in the future, and now there's also the added fear of the consequence or the anxiety of losing a reward. CPVA is also not a sign of weak or ineffectual parenting. Many parents have been told by well-meaning friends, family, even professionals that the behaviour wouldn't be happening if only they had better boundaries in place. Now, I've seen families experiencing CPVA where parenting is permissive, and I've seen it in families where parents take a much more authoritarian approach. And while parenting style clearly has an impact on the child's experience, trauma-related CPVA is not caused by a lack of authority or rules. Especially for adoptive families, there is a concern that a child who expresses themselves through violence and aggression may have inherited or learned this behaviour in their birth family. Particularly if one of the birth parents is known to have been violent, there can be a fear that the apple doesn't fall too far from the tree. Adoptive parents might also fear that the child has learned these behaviours through witnessing them in their birth family. While there's undoubtedly a chance that a child who sees adults use aggression as an effective survival strategy may unconsciously use this strategy themselves, it's, in my experience, not the main driver behind CPVA. There is also no convincing evidence that CPVA can be passed on through the genes. If there seems to be a pattern of CPVA within a family, it's more likely the result of intergenerational experiences of trauma and abuse. When they are calm, the children and teenagers I work with almost always know how they should cope with challenges. When they are able to think rationally, they absolutely know right from wrong. The problem is that violent and aggressive incidents happen when the child is not able to think rationally. In a few moments, we will look in more detail at the kind of situations that might trigger these unconscious, irrational responses. Clinical psychologist Dan Hughes, who developed the parenting approach PACE and the therapeutic approach DDP, encourages us to wonder what the message is behind the violent and aggressive behaviour. He suggests that powerful emotions such as anger, resistance and opposition may provide a cover for more vulnerable emotions such as sadness, fear and feelings of rejection. An adopted adult on Twitter recently referred to this as anger being sadness's bodyguard. When previous traumatic experiences are triggered, it feels to the child as if that experience is happening all over again in the here and now. And when this happens, the child's fear response, their survival response, is activated. For some children, that might look like hiding away or trying to appease. But for children who express themselves through CPVA, that survival response tends to be fighting and self-defense. Another issue that may contribute to CPVA could be a delay in emotional development. Many children who are adopted experienced lots of change and unpredictability in their early years, meaning that they had fewer opportunities to develop emotional maturity. Because of this, many adopted children are emotionally a lot younger than their chronological years. And one of the ways in which that immaturity shows is a lack of impulse control. Nobody is surprised if a toddler gets angry or distressed when someone tells them no, or when they're unable to do what they're trying to do. But when a 7-year-old or an 11-year-old or a 15-year-old shows the same behaviour, we are much less likely to attribute that to emotional immaturity. However, for some children, CPVA is a developmental stage that they will grow out of, just like toddlers eventually grow out of the terrible twos, with the help of their parents and other important adults. Another trigger for CPVA could be shame, particularly toxic shame. Everybody experiences feelings of shame when we're caught doing something wrong or know that we've made a mistake. But for children who've experienced early trauma, that feeling of shame can be overwhelming, unbearable, and feel like a real threat to their safety. We refer to this experience as toxic shame. While a parent might think that they are teaching their child valuable life lessons by pointing out a mistake or showing a better way to do something, for a child who experiences toxic shame, this can feel like being told that they're not good enough, perhaps even unlovable. Now, some of us manage feelings of shame by apologising or trying to put things right, but for children who express themselves through CPVA, the response to shame and toxic shame tends to be one of denial and fierce self-defence. Such a strong reaction can be baffling to parents, especially if it follows a seemingly reasonable request, such as putting their shoes away or hurrying up a bit to not be late for school. However, in those moments, it might feel to the child as if they're actually fighting for their life and their place in the family. It is no surprise that for many children who experience the consequences of early trauma and have had so much change and unpredictability in their lives already, it becomes very important to have a sense of control. In the past, when adults have been in control, scary things have happened. So now they need to try their best to always remain in control themselves. Because of their early experiences, children who are adopted may not trust that they can influence their parents or that their parents will meet their needs. And they may unconsciously use violence and aggression in order to control their parents and their environment. For many of the children I've worked with, sensory processing issues have also contributed to CPVA. Children who often feel uncomfortable in their bodies and in their environment might experience much higher levels of stress and anxiety, which means that they are less able to react calmly to challenges and disappointments. Other children with sensory processing issues might hit, kick and bite to get the sensory input that they are not getting through normal interactions. If you feel that this is something that might be affecting your child, I recommend that you check out our webinar on sensory processing. Before we move on to look at strategies, I would like to take a few minutes to think about how CPVA might affect parents. As we saw in the definition at the start of this webinar, many parents feel that they need to adapt their behaviour as a result of living with CPVA. Some parents notice that they become more permissive in order to just keep the peace, while others feel a stronger need to stick to their rules and boundaries to maintain some sense of control. I would also like to mention two potential psychological impacts of parenting a child who experiences the consequences of early life trauma and expresses their distress and fear through violence and aggression. The first of these is secondary trauma. This happens when you spend a lot of time with somebody who has been traumatized. You might have noticed that there are some people who make you feel upbeat and energized whenever you spend time with them, and that there's others who seem to drain your energy. You're exhausted after having been with them. This effect is thanks to the mirror neurons in our brain. The way that the brain helps us to understand other people's feelings is through copying with our own body in very subtle ways their facial expressions, body posture and ways of speaking. That means that we understand other people's feelings through our own body and nervous system. And the more time you spend with somebody and the more attuned you are to their feelings, the more effective your mirror neurons are. So if you're parenting a child who experiences trauma triggers and you are very attuned to them, your brain might become confused between what your child is feeling and your own feelings. You might catch yourself thinking that you're not good enough, that your child would have been better off in another family, or that you are only making things worse. This may be a sign that you're actually so close to your child that you are feeling what they are feeling, that they're not good enough to be in your family and that you would be happier without them. Another possible neurological effect of experiencing significant and continued parenting challenges is blocked care, also known as compassion fatigue. Now, to protect us from the pain of rejection of our care, the part of our brain that enables us to sacrifice ourselves for our children becomes numb. And when this happens, parents no longer feel enjoyment in the relationship with their child and find it difficult to feel empathy for them. In simple terms, the parents' feeling of love and understanding have been worn out. Parents in this situation often say things like, "I don't want anything bad to happen to my child, but I don't particularly like spending time with them." Parents who experience blocked care usually continue to do everything their child needs, but that can be very hard work without the reward of loving feelings. Thankfully, both secondary trauma and compassion fatigue, or blocked care, can be reversed. And the first step is to recognise what is going on. Many parents feel really guilty when they experience these feelings. But once they understand that their feelings are a natural biological response to the challenges they have been experiencing, they are often more able to take action to address it. Therapeutic support might be helpful in untangling the complex dynamics of secondary trauma and blocked care. Let's now take some time to think about anger. I'd like you to think about a time when you felt angry. That could be a recent incident or something that happened a while ago. Can you remember what triggered your anger? What did it feel like in your body at the time? And how did you express your anger? Did you direct your anger towards another person, an inanimate object, or perhaps yourself? And how did you feel afterwards? What did your body feel like? You might want to pause the video while you consider and reflect on these questions. As you have just seen, everybody experiences anger. Anger is one of the emotions all human beings share. Sometimes anger is necessary. It motivates us to take action, to defend ourselves, to defend others, and to get us through a potentially dangerous situation. And because of this, we should never aim for a child who expresses their distress through violence and aggression to completely stop being angry. Anger may have protected them in difficult situations in the past. Their anger may have been the only thing that meant people noticed them. For example, it may have been their angry cries that ensured that they got fed. It is more helpful to talk to children and young people about using their anger constructively and to help them think about when anger can become problematic. For example, if it happens too often, so that's exhausting for them and others, it means that there's more chance that their anger will be ignored. Or when it's expressed aggressively, anger is much more powerful when you can control it. Or if it's turned against yourself, because you deserve to treat yourself like you would do a good friend. Also, if it's taken out on somebody else or used as a tool to get what you want. Most children and young people are able to reflect on why that isn't fair. Of course, the time to have these conversations is when the child is calm and open to reflection, definitely not in the middle of an argument or incident. That is also something to bear in mind when we look at the following strategies. We work with CPVA when everyone is calm and relaxed. At the time of incidents, strategies will have very little effect, as nobody, and especially not the child, will be capable of rational thinking or learning. At those times, the priority is to keep everyone safe and to not escalate the situation further by making demands on your child or inadvertently increasing feelings of toxic shame by talking about how bad or unacceptable their behaviour is. When your child is calm, you might have a conversation about anger. Start neutral and talk about somebody else being angry or an experience of anger you've had yourself. For example, when I was driving today, somebody nearly caused an accident and they didn't even apologise. I was so angry that I was shouting at them in the car. I'm glad nobody could hear me. You know, I had to take some deep breaths to calm myself down so I could concentrate on driving again. And once anger has become a safe topic of conversation for your child, you might find an opportunity to explore it in more detail. You can talk about how sometimes anger can start small with a little irritation and get bigger with each additional annoyance or upset. You might share your experience with this and encourage your child to think of when this might have happened to them. Now make sure you keep it light-hearted and move at the child's pace. You might also talk about stuck anger. For example, when you wake up with an uneasy feeling in your stomach and that makes everything seem wrong that day. Your breakfast isn't quite right, it feels like everything's rushed, and when people talk to you, it sounds like they're telling you off all the time. Ask your child if they ever experienced that. Now make sure that you remember that your aim is to help your child to get to know their anger better, and don't get too bogged down in parenting. For example, if they said it makes them angry when their sister comes into their room, acknowledge how annoying that must be for them, without pointing out that they do the same to their sister. There will be other times to have that conversation. Explore what anger feels like for both of you. Where in your body can you feel it? Is it hot or cold, jittery or heavy? And make sure you join in their exploration too. What makes the anger smaller or even go away altogether? Again, stay focused on the aim of the conversation. If they say that being on their phone for hours on end makes their anger go away, don't remind them of the house rules on phones, but perhaps say, "Oh, that's interesting. I wonder what it is about your phone that helps to make you feel calm." For many children who experienced early trauma, feelings of calm and relaxation can actually be quite alien, and feelings that they can only access when they are completely engrossed in something, like computers or a fantasy world. Can you experiment with relaxation together and try out different things? What makes you feel calm and relaxed? Is it something quiet and still, like breathing or meditation, or something active, like playing with a dog or passing a frisbee between you? One of the reasons that relaxation may feel so alien to some children is that they feel disconnected from their bodies. In their early life, this may have been a protective function. If they were hungry, cold, wet or scared, it would have been easier to not feel their body. Activities that involve rhythm and synchronicity, like dancing, music, bouncing, swinging, can encourage feelings of safe connection with the body. And it doesn't need to be anything formal. It can be as simple as a kitchen disco or singing along to your favourite songs on the way to school. Although many children who take up dancing, horse riding or trampolining as a hobby do find a lot of benefit in this and often become really good at it too. When the opportunity arises, it would be helpful to encourage your child to think about how thoughts, feelings and situations affect the way their body feels. And you can model that yourself. I'm really looking forward to eating my lunch. I feel hungry when I think about the food we'll be having. Or a little bit more challenging, When we run late, I get a nervous feeling in my stomach and it makes me feel all hot and wobbly. I think that's why I got grumpy this morning. The more able your child is to notice their body and have an understanding of why their body reacts the way it does when they're happy, sad, frightened or angry, the more chance there is that they are able to catch themselves before they're overwhelmed by feelings and the feeling is expressed as anger. Your first aim is to help your child to feel safe enough to think about their anger. And once that is possible, you can work together to find less destructive ways of dealing with challenges. The final strategy I'd like to discuss here is to create frequent opportunities to use up all the energy that's been made available through the release of stress hormones. When your child's fear response has been triggered, and we saw how easily this could happen when we talked about toxic shame, the brain releases hormones to prepare the body for survival through fight or flight. That means that the body is ready to run away or defend itself. And when that energy isn't used, it can become stuck in the body and create feelings of jitteriness, heightened levels of anxiety, and a general feeling of not being safe. Now that can be released through taking action to use up the energy. For older children, that might be going for a walk or a run, lifting weights, or even holding a plank position. For younger children, that may be bouncing on the bed or a trampoline, or hanging upside down, or carrying heavy items. I know of parents who regularly ask their 4-year-old to help them move heavy books from one room to another, just to help them use up their anxious energy. Now make sure that you don't just suggest these kinds of activities when your child seems anxious or agitated, but plan them into your everyday routine to encourage regular discharge of excess energy. I once worked with a family whose young child would bounce wildly on the bed every night at bedtime. The parent would tell the child to lie down calmly and listen to a storybook, and many evenings the bedtime routine would end in the child becoming angry, telling their parents they hated them, and often hitting and biting them. After we spoke about this strategy of using up anxious energy, they decided to start encouraging their child to bounce before bedtime. They even made up their own family bouncing song. When the child had had enough bouncing, the next activity would be a hand massage to help them connect with their body. And after that, the child was usually calm enough for a short story and to settle down to sleep. Now, before the parents felt a loss of control when their child was bouncing wildly and refusing to lie down, and even more powerless when dealing with CPVA at bedtime. Now, they felt they were back in control and able to make sure their child's physical and emotional needs were met every night before saying goodnight. I hope this webinar has given you some opportunities to make sense of CPVA and has given you some ideas to try out with your child. Before I say goodbye, there are 2 final thoughts I would like to share with you. Many people think that progress for a family experiencing CPVA is measured in the reduction of violent or aggressive incidents. While this is of course the ultimate aim, both for the child and the parent's sake, the more immediate aim is for your child to increasingly be able to accept your comfort and care when they're sad, frightened, disappointed or embarrassed. The more comfortable they are with allowing you to be with them in these vulnerable states, the less need there is for them to unconsciously hide behind anger, aggression and violence. The strategies we have discussed here might be helpful in achieving this aim, but it may also be helpful to speak to someone about CPVA. As we have seen, the impact of CPVA on parents' well-being can be considerable, and sometimes it is impossible for a parent in crisis to be playful, curious and reflective with their child without additional support. Lastly, many parents fear that CPVA incidents will have an erosive effect on their connection with their child, particularly if parents are experiencing compassion fatigue or blocked care. It can feel like the relationship is damaged with each further incident. However, Dan Hughes reminds us that attachment relationships are strengthened through conflict and repair. So that means that relationships which are repeatedly challenged but where parents continue to be there for the child no matter what, perhaps after some time for everyone to calm and collect themselves, are actually stronger than relationships that are never challenged. In the same way that two people who are in a tug of war are a little bit closer to each other each time the rope breaks and is knotted together, connections can become closer each time a family weathers a CPVA storm.